The Inquisition of Galileo in 1616 and his subsequent trial in 1642 has become a tale of combat between the voices of scientific freedom, represented by Galileo, and the forces of theological intolerance represented by the Christian Church. Well, that narrative is seriously deficient as history. The Galileo affair was not a battle between science and Christianity. I mean, think about it. Every single one of the participants on both sides of the Inquisition and both sides of the trial were Christians. The conflict was really within the church between opposing theories of biblical interpretation and then also within science between alternative cosmologies. Two main points seem to be forgotten or ignored when it comes to Galileo. First of all, the theological decisions in the trial and the Inquisition, they were powerfully shaped by the local circumstances and personal interests of the players. Second point, which is what this video is about, that in both the Inquisition and the trial, the scientific decisions were based on the current scientific evidence of the day. Now, because of the ancient Greek scientific views of Aristotle and then of Ptolemy, the Western view of the solar system had been geocentric or Earth-centered since at least the 4th century. The heliocentric or the sun-centered model, that was really more of a curiosity until Copernicus published his textbook On the Revolutions in 1543. But Copernicus's book was highly technical and written for a very small audience of mathematically proficient astronomers. It was little known and less read, and then read a little bit more when Thomas Digges in England translated it into English in 1546. But there was almost no reaction from the Catholic Church. Nobody judged Copernicus as dangerous or a threat. In other words, scientists writing about heliocentrism, publishing books on heliocentrism or the Copernican model, they were not the issue. In the 16th century, there was also very little scientific evidence in support of a heliocentric model being physically true. Heliocentrism was rejected because of the science, not because of blind conservatism, not because of some religious intolerance. And what seems to be forgotten is the church in the Galileo affair was actually following the science. Now, in the late 1500s, Tycho Brahe took incredible amounts of data on the stars and the planets. He was the leading astronomer of the time. He thought that his model fit a geocentric system, kind of a hybrid geocentric system with the Earth at the center and then the stars and the sun going around the Earth, and then all the other planets, they were orbiting the sun. So Tycho Brahe, who had all the data and the evidence, he supported a geocentric system. Other scientists like Johann Georg Locker from Germany, Monsignor Francisco Ingoli from Italy, Marius of Ansbach from Germany, Peter Kruger, who was the leading Polish mathematician, and then Giovanni Battista Riccioli from Italy later on in 1651. They all wrote and published papers about how the data and the scientific evidence of the time supported geocentrism and actually was against heliocentrism. So what was the evidence of the time in the early 1600s that supported geocentrism, Brahe's system, over Copernicus' system of heliocentrism? Well, there were several lines of evidence. Ingoli in his booklet used 20 or so pieces of evidence to support geocentrism. Riccioli in 1651 presented, I think, 44 arguments for heliocentrism, but there really were just two that were kind of like the knockdown, drag-out arguments that the heliocentrists had no answer for, and then really supported the Earth not moving and the Earth being at the center of the solar system. So the first piece of evidence were the stars. The evidence, and even when looking through a telescope, the evidence supported the geocentric model. For Copernicus to be correct, the stars would have had to have been incredibly huge. The absence of stellar parallax required the stars to be really far away. And then based on the size measurements of the time, since the stars were so far away, they would have had to have been humongous. One single star, for example, in the Copernican system could have been larger than the entire universe that was predicted by the hybrid geocentric system. So the data supported reasonably sized stars, the stars that were predicted in Brahe's hybrid geocentric system. According to the scientific evidence we had at the time, even data taken with a telescope, the necessary sizes of stars would have had made the Copernican system totally absurd. Second piece of data was the moving Earth. Well, first of all, it was a violation of common sense. We had no way to detect the motion of the Earth, so we did not know that it was moving. There was also no conclusive evidence from falling bodies. Brahe had arguments from the late 1500s about what we would see when we fired cannonballs on the equator and then fired cannonballs from the poles. So there's no conclusive evidence about using cannonballs and using falling bodies that supported the fact that the Earth was moving. Really crucial, though, is that the moving Earth violated the only comprehensive system of physics in place at the time, and that was Aristotle. And so we did not have good data to support heliocentrism. The stars would have had to have been huge, and we had no conclusive data that the Earth was actually moving. Now, Galileo did have data and arguments for heliocentrism. He looked through his telescope and saw that the moon was rocky and probably made of the same material that the Earth was made of. And since the moon was moving through space, and it was made of the same material as the Earth, then the Earth could be moving through space also. He also saw Venus passing through a complete set of phases, just like the moon did. He saw Jupiter and Saturn having satellites. And so if the Jupiter and Saturn's satellites could orbit them while they were moving, then the moon could orbit us while we were moving. Now, these observations were in contradiction with Aristotle, and they were in contradiction with Ptolemy, but they could be explained, and they'd actually been predicted by Brahe in his hybrid geocentric model. Galileo also saw sunspots on the sun, and that went against the Aristotelian idea of the heavens being made of this incorruptible fifth element that made the heavens perfect. So Galileo showed that the heavens were not perfect. So Galileo's evidence showed that Ptolemy's universe was not correct, and it went against some of the things that Aristotle had said, but it did not show that Copernicus was superior to Brahe. Ironically, the Copernican answer to the star size problem, the fact that the stars had to be huge, their answer was simply to invoke the power of God. So it was the heliocentric Copernicus supporters who were using God as an explanation of their system, and it was the geocentric Earth not moving supporters that were actually using the science of the day. So almost 20 years after Galileo's second trial, Riccioli, in his booklet that he published, thought that the telescope evidence and the data from falling objects in 1651 still supported the hybrid geocentric universe of Tycho Brahe. It did not support the heliocentric one of Copernicus. It's tempting from a modern perspective to propose that the leading theologians of the church ought to have just modified their interpretation of the relevant biblical texts in order to get into step with the scientific opinion. But we have to keep in mind that the position adopted by the Inquisition was in step with the majority and the latest scientific opinion. Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, who was part of the First Inquisition, echoed the historical position of the church fathers Augustine and Aquinas, saying that if there was solid evidence for the Copernican system, then the literal sense of Scripture of the Bible would have to give way to a different interpretation and support the heliocentric system. So the church was open to changing their interpretation of biblical passages if the current science showed it, but it didn't. David C. Lindbergh, in his book, When Science and Christianity Meet, came up with three conclusions of the Galileo affair. First of all, he said that personal interest and political ambition were just as important as ideology and observation. He thought if Galileo had paid more attention to diplomacy, the outcome of the second trial may have been totally different. Galileo's second trial was more about disobedience and flagrant insubordination than it was about science. Second conclusion, the Galileo affair was powerfully influenced by local circumstances. The Reformation, the 30 Years' War, the power of the papacy being threatened by the Spanish, and the criticism of Pope Urban for favoring Protestant King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden all played a part in how Galileo was dealt with. And thirdly, the point of this video, that this was not a battle between science and Christianity. Again, every one of the combatants, including Galileo, was a Christian. The conflict was within the church between opposing theories of biblical interpretation and then within science between alternative cosmologies. Also keep in mind that Galileo's punishment after his second trial was simply house arrest. This allowed Galileo to turn to other scientific problems. Galileo's mechanics, as described in his discourse on two new sciences, served to overturn the Aristotelian view of the world. We needed an entire new system of physics before we could get rid of Aristotle and geocentrism. So one could argue that the punishment imposed by the Catholic Church actually advanced science and heliocentrism more than if they had left Galileo unpunished. The narrative that Galileo, in his trial, in his Inquisition, the narrative that that's an example of Christianity persecuting science is simply false. The scientific evidence in Galileo's time did not support the Copernican view of the universe. The Church held to a geocentric position because of the current scientific data. A clear demonstration of the motion of the Earth and a complete answer to the problem of the humongous stars would not come for 2 more centuries. Science and Christianity are not in opposition. The Galileo story is one of science versus science, and also theology versus theology within the Church. The Galileo affair should not be used to illustrate a war between science and Christianity.